people are naturally resistant to the graphic realities of horror. It's something that human beings in general do not want to take into their reality, because it's a kind of nonsense. I really believe it's a kind of nonsense. The reason that I told some individual stories that were close to me, from my sister, my niece, friends, was because I think that is the only way to catch catastrophe. If you ignore the particular, it becomes, as you say, unreal. It becomes something that is spectacle. And 9/11 was particularly prone to becoming a spectacle because of the television images. And you weren't close, you weren't with the people standing in the windows. The perspective most people in the world had was of tremendous distance, and a spectacle almost like movies, which is what I wrote in the essay, that the television images very closely resembled disaster movies. So I don't think it's odd that people who were not in New York City would recall it that way. You know, horrifying events have taken place over the course of recorded human history, and we mustn't forget that. In that sense, September 11th, 2001 is not unique. It is one of many horrifying events. And if you take something that occurred on a much, much larger scale, the Holocaust, for example, I think the way people enter that monstrous reality is only through individual stories, and not through saying, 6 million Jews were killed. Shortly after the event, a lot of people made very dramatic declarations. I will never do the same kind of work. Irony is dead. There's no irony left in the world. There were a lot of silly things that were written. I have to say that I honestly felt none of that. It never occurred to me for one single second. And I was worried about my own sisters. I was worried about my family. My daughter had taken the subway under the World Trade Center only half an hour before, so I had to first reassure myself that the people I loved were whole. Contemplating it, however, my very first thought when I knew that those buildings had been attacked was, so now it comes to us, now it's close to us. And I never had any thoughts that irony was dead. All of that seemed absurd to me. New York City is as much an idea as an actual place. The reality, however, and I found this to be true since I moved to New York in 1978, which is now over 30 years ago, is that it changes all the time. The New York I moved to is not, what it was then is not what it is now, even in terms of its appearance. New York is constantly being built and neighborhoods are shifting. But there is an atmosphere in New York City of tolerance. And the great irony of September 11th was, in fact, that so many people from so many different countries, people who were not actually Americans, who had citizenship in other places all over the world, died in that event. So there's something absurd and miscalculated about the whole business. But living in New York, you feel an enormous tolerance, which isn't to say that there aren't bad incidents, but 40% of New Yorkers were born somewhere else. So that should give you an idea. I actually did interview a number of psychiatrists and psychoanalysts for my book. The Sorrows of an American. The narrator is a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst. And the day of September 11th, there were very few injuries. People either died or they escaped. So doctors, MDs, and many psychiatrists, psychoanalysts obviously are doctors. They ran to the hospitals, and no one came. So they waited all day. I talked to a number of doctors who were waiting. So the day of, psychiatrists were not giving much aid to anybody. But later, a number of psychiatrists and psychoanalysts told me that they saw people who, in one way or another, had been traumatized by that day. And actually, there were a number of seminars in, psychoanalytic societies and institutes that specifically addressed post-September 11th traumatic experiences. It's interesting, and I think important to note that you didn't have to be close to the event necessarily. There were people traumatized who were very close, something we can understand well, and also people quite far away. And I knew some families who picked up and left the city after September 11th. Just a few. It was certainly not the majority. I think most people felt firmly rooted, even more intensely loyal to New York City after September 11th. But there were others who simply wanted to escape.